There are places in Alabama where the earth remembers things we've tried to forget, where the red clay holds secrets deeper than roots, and the pines stand so thick that even at noon, shadows pool between the trunks like spilled ink. Cullman County is one of those places, a landscape of rolling hills and forgotten farmland, where families have worked the same soil for generations, where everyone knows everyone, and where a child's laughter should be the safest sound in the world. But on October 17, 1999, that safety shattered. Emma Grace Whitfield was 7 years old when she disappeared. 7 years old, with a smile that came slow but bright, and a habit of humming to herself when she thought no one was listening. She lived with her mother, Patricia Whitfield, in a small rental house near Cullman proper, but she spent most weekends at her grandmother's farm, 15 acres of pasture and woods where Emma could roam, where she could feed the chickens and chase grasshoppers through the tall grass, where she felt, her mother would later say, truly free. October 17th was a Sunday. The kind of day that starts perfect. Blue sky, stretched tight overhead, air just cool enough to need a sweater in the morning, but warm by afternoon. Patricia had dropped Emma off Saturday evening, as she often did, trusting her own mother, Doris Whitfield, to watch the girl while Patricia worked a double shift at the textile mill. Doris was 63, sharp as a tack, a woman who'd raised 5 children on that same property and never lost one to so much as a broken bone. She knew every inch of that land. She knew its dangers. Emma spent Saturday night the way she always did, helping Doris snap green beans on the porch, watching reruns of old game shows, falling asleep in the guest room with its faded quilt and the window cracked open to let in the night sounds. Sunday morning they had pancakes. Doris remembers because Emma ate 3, drowning them in syrup, and asked if they could pick blackberries later, even though the season had passed. Doris told her maybe next summer. Emma said okay and went outside to play. That was around 1:30 in the afternoon. Doris was inside washing dishes when she glanced out the kitchen window and saw Emma near the chicken coop at the far edge of the yard, maybe 70 yards from the house. The girl was crouched down, poking at something in the dirt with a stick. Doris smiled to herself, turned back to the sink, and finished the last of the plates. She couldn't have looked away for more than 10 minutes, maybe 15 at most. When she looked again, Emma was gone. At first, Doris didn't panic. Emma wandered sometimes, not far, never far, but she'd follow a butterfly into the trees or circle around to the front yard without saying anything. Doris dried her hands and stepped out onto the porch, calling Emma's name in that sing-song voice grandmothers use, the one that's half affection and half command. No answer. She called again, louder this time, and walked across the yard toward the coop. The chickens were agitated, clucking and pacing inside the wire fence. But Emma wasn't there. Doris checked the barn. She checked the garden. She walked the perimeter of the house, calling and calling, her voice growing sharper with each repetition. By 2:15, the first thread of real fear began to pull tight in her chest. By 2:30, she was on the phone with Patricia, and by 3 o'clock, the Cullman County Sheriff's Department had been notified. Deputy Marcus Halloran was the first to arrive. He was 29 then, new to the county, still learning the back roads and family names that made up the fabric of the place. He remembers pulling up to the Whitfield property and seeing Doris standing in the yard, arms wrapped around herself, her face pale and drawn. Patricia hadn't arrived yet. She was driving in from town, but Doris had already begun searching the tree line, shouting Emma's name until her voice cracked. Halloran asked the standard questions. When did you last see her? What was she wearing? Could she have walked to a neighbor's house? Doris answered each one, steady at first, then breaking on the last. There were no close neighbors. The nearest house was over a mile down the road. Emma wouldn't have gone that far alone. She knew better. She was a good girl. She listened. Halloran radioed for backup and started a grid search of the property. Within an hour, 6 more deputies arrived, along with a K9 unit and a handful of volunteers from the community, men who knew these woods, who'd hunted deer and turkey in them since they were boys. They spread out in a line and moved slowly into the forest behind the house, calling Emma's name, listening for any sound of movement or crying. The dogs picked up a scent trail near the coop and followed it into the trees, but after a quarter-mile, the trail went cold. By nightfall, over 50 people were searching. Flashlights bobbed through the darkness like fireflies. Voices echoing off the trunks, radios crackling with static and negative reports. Patricia Whitfield stood near the house, pale and shaking, refusing to sit down, refusing to leave, her eyes locked on the tree line as if sheer will could bring her daughter walking out of the dark. Doris sat on the porch steps, silent now, her hands clasped so tight her knuckles were white. The first night passed without finding Emma. The second day brought helicopters, news crews, and a command center set up in Doris's front yard. The story spread fast. Local TV stations picked it up, then regional networks, then national. A 7-year-old girl missing in rural Alabama. No witnesses, no leads, just gone. Search teams combed through hundreds of acres, checking every ravine, every hollow, every deer trail that cut through the underbrush. They dragged the creek that ran along the western edge of the property. They searched abandoned barns and old hunting cabins scattered throughout the forest. They interviewed neighbors, distant relatives, anyone who might have been on that road Sunday afternoon. Nothing. But on the third day, a volunteer searcher named Roy Clemens found something. Roy was a local mechanic, 46 years old, a man who spent his weekends fishing and bow hunting. He knew the Bankhead Forest better than most, knew the landmarks and the hidden places where the land dipped and folded in on itself. He'd been assigned a section of woods about 2 miles northeast of the Whitfield property, following the creek upstream where it narrowed and the banks grew steep. The terrain was rough, thick with laurel and fallen logs, the kind of place a child wouldn't wander into by choice. He almost missed it. There, on a flat stone jutting out over the creek, was a single pink sneaker, small, child-sized, with Velcro straps and a scuff on the toe. Roy's breath caught. He radioed it in immediately, and within minutes deputies were scrambling through the woods to his location. The shoe was photographed, bagged, and brought back to the command center, where Patricia Whitfield collapsed at the sight of it, confirming through tears that it was Emma's. But it was the condition of the shoe that made investigators go quiet. It wasn't muddy. It wasn't torn or damaged. The Velcro was fastened neatly, and the laces, thin white laces that Emma had never learned to tie herself, were tied in a perfect bow. The shoe had been placed on that stone, deliberately, almost ceremonially. It hadn't been dropped or lost in a struggle. Someone had put it there. The discovery shifted the investigation immediately. This was no longer just a lost child case. This was something else, something darker. The FBI was called in, and within 24 hours, a team of federal agents had joined the search, bringing cadaver dogs, forensic specialists, and a grim new focus. They scoured the area around the creek, looking for signs of a grave, looking for Emma's body. They didn't find one. What they did find, however, were other things, strange things, things that didn't fit any clear narrative. About 30 yards upstream from where the shoe was found, a deputy noticed markings on a tree trunk, deep gouges in the bark running vertical, spaced oddly apart. They were too high for a child to have made, nearly 8 feet up the trunk, and too deep to be from any tool the searchers were carrying. The bark was torn away in strips, exposing pale wood underneath. A wildlife expert brought in to examine the marks said they looked like claw marks, possibly from a black bear, though black bears were rare in that part of Alabama and rarely aggressive. Still, it was possible. Bears had been known to scratch trees, marking territory or sharpening claws, but there was something about the spacing, the depth, that didn't quite match. Further into the woods, searchers found a section of undergrowth that had been disturbed, branches snapped at odd angles, leaves scattered as if something large had moved through quickly. There were impressions in the soft earth, partial prints that didn't register clearly enough to identify. One of the K9 handlers said his dog had refused to follow a scent trail past a certain point, whining and pulling back on the leash, hackles raised. The handler had never seen the dog act that way before. And then there were the reports from locals, whispered at first, then spoken aloud when no other explanation seemed to fit. A man named Carl Dupree, who lived about 3 miles from the Whitfield property, told deputies he'd heard something strange the night Emma disappeared. He'd been out on his porch around dusk, smoking a cigarette, when he heard what he described as a low, guttural sound coming from the woods. Not quite an animal, not quite human. He said it made the hair on his arms stand up, made him go inside and lock the door, even though he'd lived in those woods his whole life and never been afraid of them before. A woman named Shelley Krantz, who worked at the gas station on Highway 278, said a customer had come in Monday morning, talking about seeing something moving through the trees near Doris Whitfield's property Sunday evening. Something too tall to be a person, moving too fast to be a deer. The customer had been driving past and only caught a glimpse, but it had unsettled him enough to mention it. Were these stories real? Or were they just the kind of rural legends that bloom in the wake of tragedy, when people need something to explain the unexplainable? The investigators didn't dismiss them, but they didn't give them weight either. They focused on facts, on evidence, on the shoe. The shoe told them Emma had made it 2 miles from her grandmother's house through dense forest before something happened. The shoe told them someone, or something, had interacted with her. The shoe told them this was deliberate, but it didn't tell them where Emma was. Days turned into weeks. The search continued, though the number of volunteers dwindled as the initial urgency faded into grim routine. The FBI set up interviews with registered sex offenders in the county, checked alibis, ran background checks. They looked at family members, at Doris's neighbors, at anyone who might have had access to the property. Nothing connected. No one had a motive. No one had opportunity. Patricia Whitfield appeared on the local news, her face drawn and exhausted, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. She held up a school photo of Emma, that shy smile, those hazel eyes, and her voice broke as she said, "Please, if you know anything, if you've seen anything, please help us bring her home." But the days kept passing, and Emma didn't come home. By November, the command center was dismantled. The search was officially scaled back, though it never truly stopped. Deputies continued to follow up on tips, and volunteers still walked the woods on weekends, hoping against hope to find something the professionals had missed. Doris Whitfield stopped giving interviews. She stopped answering the phone. She sat in her house and stared out the window at the tree line, waiting for a little girl in yellow and denim to come walking out of the shadows. Patricia returned to work because she had no choice, but those who knew her said she was never the same. She moved through life like a ghost, present but not really there, always listening for a sound that never came. And in the woods behind the Whitfield property, the forest grew quiet again. The leaves fell, winter came, and the land settled back into its old rhythms. But the people who lived there, the ones who'd searched, the ones who'd heard the stories, they didn't forget. They walked a little faster past those trees. They kept their children closer. They locked their doors at night. Because something had happened in those woods, something they couldn't explain, couldn't prove, couldn't name. And whatever it was, it had taken Emma Grace Whitfield and left nothing behind but a single pink sneaker tied in a bow she'd never learned to make. The case went cold. Officially, it remained open, filed away in a cabinet at the Cullman County Sheriff's Department, but with no new leads and no evidence, there was nowhere left to look. The FBI moved on to other cases. The news cameras left. Life, as it always does, continued, but the questions didn't go away. What happened to Emma Grace Whitfield in those woods? Did someone take her, someone who knew the land well enough to vanish without a trace? Or was it something else, something the investigators couldn't categorize, couldn't track, couldn't understand? In the years that followed, there were occasional sightings, unconfirmed reports of a girl matching Emma's description seen in gas stations, in shopping centers, always fleeting, always unverifiable. None of them led anywhere. There were tips phoned in by psychics, by well-meaning strangers, by people who claimed to have dreams or visions. The deputies followed up on everyone, but none of them brought Emma home. Doris Whitfield died in 2006, 7 years after Emma disappeared. Those who attended her funeral said she looked smaller somehow, like the weight of grief had compressed her into something fragile. Patricia scattered her mother's ashes at the edge of the property, near the tree line, where Emma had last been seen. She didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say, and the case stayed cold for 26 years. Until 3 weeks ago, when a man named Leonard Pike was arrested in Mobile, Alabama, on unrelated charges, and during a routine search of his property, investigators found something that changed everything. Leonard Pike was 68 years old when they arrested him. A wiry man, with thinning grey hair and hands that trembled slightly when he spoke, he'd lived alone, in a rundown house on the outskirts of Mobile, for the past 15 years. Neighbors described him as quiet, reclusive, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without noticing. He kept to himself, worked odd jobs when he could get them, and had a history that raised red flags the moment investigators started digging. Pike had been arrested on a probation violation. Nothing dramatic, just a failure to report to his parole officer after a previous conviction for breaking and entering. Standard procedure meant a search of his residence, and that's when Mobile County deputies found the box. It was tucked in the back of a closet, underneath old clothes and stacks of yellowed newspapers. A shoebox, faded and water-stained, filled with items that made the deputies go very still. Photographs of children, newspaper clippings, small objects, a hair ribbon, a keychain, a single earring, and at the bottom, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, was a child's drawing. The drawing showed a house and a tree, rendered in crayon, with the unsteady hand of someone very young. In the corner, written in careful letters, was a name, Emma. Within hours, the box was on its way to the FBI lab in Quantico. Within 2 days, the drawing had been confirmed, through handwriting analysis and comparison with school records, to have been made by Emma Grace Whitfield. The paper matched the type used in Cullman County elementary schools in 1999. The crayons matched a set Patricia Whitfield confirmed she'd bought for her daughter that summer. Leonard Pike had Emma's drawing, a drawing that should have been in a classroom or a home, not hidden in a box of trophies collected by a man with a record. The news broke like thunder. After 26 years, the investigation into Emma's disappearance was no longer cold. Reporters descended on Mobile, on Cullman County, on anyone who'd been connected to the original case. Patricia Whitfield, now 53 and working as a nursing assistant in Birmingham, received the call from investigators and collapsed in the hospital hallway where she worked. When she could finally speak, all she said was, "Is she alive? Please tell me she's alive." They couldn't, not yet, because Leonard Pike wasn't talking. He'd been read his Miranda rights and had immediately requested a lawyer. He sat in the interrogation room in Mobile County Jail, silent and expressionless, while detectives laid out the evidence in front of him, the drawing, the other items in the box, his criminal history, his location in 1999. Because that's what made the case explode across every news network in the country. Leonard Pike had been living in Cullman County in October of 1999. He'd been renting a small trailer about 8 miles from the Whitfield property, working part-time at a lumber yard, staying just under the radar. He had no alibi for October 17th. And when investigators cross-referenced his employment records and known locations, they found something that made their blood run cold. Pike had worked at that lumber yard for 6 months. During that time, he'd made deliveries throughout the county, including to properties near the Bankhead National Forest. He knew the area. He knew the roads. He knew the woods. But there was more. In 2003, Pike had been questioned in connection with another missing child case in Georgia. A 9-year-old boy who'd disappeared from a campground. Pike had been working at that campground as a maintenance worker. The boy was never found, and there wasn't enough evidence to charge Pike, but the investigators had noted him as a person of interest. He'd moved to Florida shortly after, then Mississippi, then back to Alabama, always staying in rural areas, always taking jobs that kept him on the periphery of communities. The profile fit, transient, isolated, access to children, a history of being in the wrong place at too many wrong times. The FBI took over the interrogation, sending their best behavioral analysts to try to break Pike's silence. They used every technique, building rapport, applying pressure, presenting evidence, offering deals. Pike sat through it all with the same blank expression, occasionally sipping water, never asking questions, never offering explanations. His lawyer, a public defender named Sharon Reeves, advised him to stay silent, and Pike listened. Days turned into a week. The media frenzy intensified. Vigils were held in Cullman County. Patricia Whitfield appeared on national television, her voice steady but her eyes hollow, saying she just wanted to know what happened to her daughter. She wanted to bring Emma home, even if it was just to bury her. Then, 9 days after Pike's arrest, a hunter in Cullman County made another discovery. His name was Thomas Rigby, 52, a man who'd been hunting white-tailed deer in the Bankhead Forest for 30 years. He was checking trail cameras he'd set up near a ravine about 4 miles from the Whitfield property, farther than the original search had extended, when he noticed something odd. One of his cameras had been knocked over, the mounting bracket bent, as if something had struck it with considerable force. When Rigby picked up the camera to reset it, he saw the photos stored in its memory. Most were standard: deer, raccoons, the occasional coyote passing through at night. But there was one image, time-stamped 3 weeks prior, that made Rigby's hands shake. It showed a figure at the edge of the frame, caught in the camera's motion sensor at 3:47 in the morning. The image was grainy, taken in infrared, but the shape was unmistakable. It was tall, taller than any person should be, hunched forward, moving through the trees with a strange, loping gait. The limbs were elongated, the proportions wrong. It could have been a trick of shadows, a distortion caused by the camera angle and the infrared light. But Rigby had seen thousands of trail camera photos, and he'd never seen anything like this. He called the sheriff's department immediately. When deputies arrived and retrieved the camera, they found more. On the ground near where the camera had been positioned, there were impressions in the soft earth, tracks that didn't match anything they could identify. They were large, roughly 14 inches long, with what appeared to be claw marks at the front. The spacing suggested something walking upright, but the depth of the impressions indicated significant weight, more than a human would leave. A wildlife biologist from Auburn University was brought in to examine the tracks. She took measurements, made casts, compared them to known animal prints. Her conclusion was inconclusive. The tracks resembled bear prints in some ways, but the gait was wrong. Bears walked on all fours, occasionally rearing up, but these tracks showed consistent bipedal movement. She suggested it could be a deformity, an injured bear moving in an unusual way, but she couldn't say for certain. And then there was the smell. Multiple searchers who returned to the area reported a pungent odor near the ravine, something organic and rotten, but not quite like decay. One deputy described it as musky, like wet dog but stronger, with a metallic undertone that made his eyes water. Another said it reminded her of the smell near a zoo enclosure, but worse. The odor seemed to move, never concentrated in one place, always just at the edge of perception. The discovery reignited the question that had haunted the original investigation. Was Emma taken by a person or by something else? The rational explanation was clear. Leonard Pike was a predator, a man who'd spent decades moving from place to place, evading suspicion, collecting trophies from his victims. He'd been in Cullman County when Emma disappeared. He had her drawing. He fit the profile perfectly. The trail camera photo and the strange tracks were coincidences, misidentifications, the forest playing tricks in the dark. But there was another explanation, one that people didn't want to say out loud but couldn't stop thinking about. In rural Alabama, in the deep woods and the forgotten hollows, there are stories, old stories passed down through generations about things that live in the spaces between. The Appalachian Mountains, which stretch down into northern Alabama, have always been a place of folklore, tales of creatures that walk on two legs but aren't human, things that watch from the shadows, that leave signs but are never seen clearly. Some called them wood apes. Others used different names, older names, pulled from Cherokee and Creek traditions about forest spirits and shapeshifters. The stories varied, but the core was always the same. There are things in the deep woods that we don't understand, things that are intelligent enough to avoid us, powerful enough to take what they want. Was it possible? Could something like that have taken Emma? The investigators didn't entertain the theory officially, but privately, some of them wondered. Deputy Marcus Halloran, now a sergeant with the Cullman County Sheriff's Department, admitted in an interview that he'd never been comfortable with how the original search ended. He remembered the dogs refusing to track past certain points. He remembered the claw marks on the tree, the way the forest had felt wrong that week, oppressive and watching. But wondering wasn't evidence, and evidence pointed to Leonard Pike. The problem was, Pike still wasn't talking, and without a confession, without Emma's body, the case was circumstantial. The drawing proved Pike had taken something from Emma or her family, but it didn't prove he'd killed her. His lawyer argued the drawing could have been obtained innocently, found in a thrift store or picked up at a yard sale. It was thin, but it was enough to create reasonable doubt. The prosecutor needed more. They needed Pike to break, so they tried a different approach. They brought Patricia Whitfield to Mobile. It wasn't standard procedure. Victims' families rarely participated directly in interrogations, but Patricia insisted, and the FBI agreed, hoping that seeing the mother of the girl he'd allegedly taken might crack Pike's resolve. Patricia sat across from Leonard Pike in that small, fluorescent-lit room, separated by a table bolted to the floor. Pike's lawyer sat beside him, arms crossed, ready to shut down any inappropriate questions. But Patricia didn't ask questions. She just looked at Pike, her eyes red but dry, and she spoke. She told him about Emma, about how Emma had loved drawing, how she'd filled notebooks with pictures of birds and flowers, and the farmhouse where she felt safe. She told him about the day Emma was born, how small she'd been, how Patricia had held her and promised to keep her safe. She told him about the 26 years she'd spent not knowing, the birthdays marked with candles lit for a daughter who never came home, the Christmases where she still bought presents and left them unwrapped in a closet. And then Patricia said, "I need to know what happened to my daughter. I need to bring her home. If you have any decency, any humanity left, please tell me where she is." Pike looked at Patricia for a long moment. His hands, cuffed in front of him, trembled slightly. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something, but Pike shook his head. He opened his mouth, and for the first time since his arrest, Leonard Pike spoke. "I didn't take your daughter." The room went silent. Patricia's breath caught. The FBI agents leaned forward. Pike continued, his voice rough and low. "I found that drawing. I found it in the woods near a creek, maybe a week after she went missing. I was out there. I was out there looking, same as everyone else. I saw the search parties. I heard about the little girl. And I found that drawing, just lying there on the ground, like it had been dropped." "Why didn't you turn it in?" one of the agents asked. Pike's jaw tightened. Because I knew how it would look. I had a record. I knew they'd come after me if I showed up with evidence, so I kept it. I shouldn't have, I know that. But I didn't take her. I didn't touch her. Then who did? Patricia whispered. Pike looked down at his hands. I don't know. But I saw something out there. Something I can't explain. The agents exchanged glances. Pike's lawyer put a hand on his arm, but Pike kept talking, the words spilling out like he'd been holding them back for years. I was out there at night, a few days after the search started. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that little girl, alone in those woods. So I went out with a flashlight, checking areas the search parties hadn't covered yet. And I heard something. A sound I'd never heard before, low and wrong, like a growl but deeper, resonating in my chest. He paused, swallowing hard. I turned off my flashlight because I didn't want whatever it was to see me, and I waited. And then I saw it, just for a second, moving between the trees maybe 30 yards away. It was tall, taller than me, and it moved wrong, like its joints bent in places they shouldn't. I ran. I've never run from anything in my life, but I ran. The room was silent. Patricia stared at Pike, searching his face for any sign of deception. The agents remained impassive, but internally they were recalibrating. Was this a deflection? A calculated attempt to introduce reasonable doubt by playing into local folklore? Or was Leonard Pike telling the truth? Over the next 2 weeks, investigators tore apart Pike's alibi and his story. They searched his trailer from 1999, now occupied by someone else, but still structurally the same. They found nothing. They interviewed people who'd known him back then. No one remembered him acting suspiciously. He'd been quiet, kept to himself, but no one had ever seen him with children or near the Whitfield property. They re-examined the evidence from the original case. The shoe, the claw marks, the disturbed undergrowth. They compared Pike's shoe size to the impressions found near the creek. They didn't match. Pike wore a size 9. The impressions were at least a 14, possibly larger. The case began to fracture. The prosecutor was confident they could get a conviction on possession of evidence from a crime scene, but without a body, without a clear connection to Emma's disappearance, the murder charge was shaky. Pike's story about finding the drawing was impossible to disprove, and the more investigators looked into the physical evidence, the more inconsistencies appeared. The claw marks on the tree were too high and too deep for Pike to have made, even with a tool. The spacing didn't match human hands. The shoe had been placed deliberately, but there were no fingerprints, no DNA, nothing linking Pike to it. And the trail camera photo, while explainable as a distortion or a misidentified animal, added to the growing sense that something else had been in those woods. Public opinion split. Some believed Pike was guilty, that he was a predator who'd finally been caught and was now using folklore to create doubt. Others believed him, believed that something unexplainable had taken Emma, something the authorities didn't want to acknowledge because it fell outside the boundaries of rational investigation. And then, 21 days after Pike's arrest, a hiker found bones. The hiker's name was Jennifer Costner, a 34-year-old environmental consultant from Huntsville who spent her weekends exploring the less-traveled sections of the Bankhead National Forest. She'd been following an old logging road that had grown over with brush, mapping out potential sites for a conservation project, when she noticed something white, partially buried in the leaves, near the base of a limestone outcropping. At first, she thought it was a piece of PVC pipe or debris left by hunters, but when she crouched down and brushed away the leaf litter, her breath stopped. It was bone. Small, delicate, unmistakably human. Jennifer backed away slowly, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. No signal. She marked the location on her GPS unit and ran back to her car, driving until she found reception, then called 911. Within an hour, the area was cordoned off, and forensic teams were carefully excavating the site. The bones were scattered across a small area, maybe 15 feet in diameter, partially covered by years of accumulated forest debris. A forensic anthropologist from the University of Alabama was brought in to oversee the recovery. She worked methodically, photographing each bone in place before carefully extracting it, noting the position, the condition, the signs of weathering and animal activity. It took 2 days to recover everything. The bones belonged to a child, female, approximately 6 to 8 years old at time of death. The remains had been there for years. The anthropologist estimated between 15 and 30 years based on the degree of weathering and the growth patterns of roots that had wound through the rib cage. Dental records confirmed what everyone already feared. The bones belonged to Emma Grace Whitfield. Patricia received the news at her apartment in Birmingham. She'd been waiting, had known since the moment she heard about the discovery that it would be Emma. When the detective told her, Patricia simply nodded, closed her eyes, and said, "Can I see her?" They told her not yet, that the remains were still being processed, but they promised she could when the time came. Patricia thanked them, hung up the phone, and sat in silence for a long time. The discovery of Emma's remains should have brought closure, should have answered the questions that had haunted the investigation for 26 years. Instead, it raised new ones. Because the bones told a story that didn't fit any narrative the investigators had constructed. The forensic anthropologist's report was thorough and deeply troubling. Emma's skeleton showed no signs of trauma consistent with murder. No broken bones from a struggle, no cut marks from a knife, no fractures to the skull. The hyoid bone, which often shows damage in strangulation cases, was intact. Cause of death could not be determined from the skeletal remains alone, which wasn't unusual given the time that had passed. But it eliminated many of the scenarios investigators had considered. More disturbing was the location. The bones had been found nearly 6 miles from Doris Whitfield's property, in a section of forest so remote and difficult to access that even experienced hikers rarely ventured there. The terrain was steep, riddled with ravines and dense undergrowth. For Emma to have walked there alone was nearly impossible. For someone to have carried her there seemed equally unlikely. The path would have been treacherous even for an adult in daylight, let alone at night while carrying a struggling child. And then there were the bones themselves. Several of them showed unusual markings. The anthropologist noted what appeared to be scratches or gouges on the surface of the femur and humerus, shallow grooves that ran parallel to the bone's length. Under microscopic examination, the marks showed characteristics consistent with tooth marks, but the spacing and depth didn't match any known predator in the region. They weren't from coyotes, which had small, closely spaced teeth. They weren't from bears, which typically crushed bones rather than leaving clean parallel marks. They weren't from feral dogs. The pattern was wrong, the spacing too wide, the pressure too controlled. A wildlife forensics expert from the US. Fish and Wildlife Service was consulted. He examined the marks, compared them to databases of known animal dentition, ran simulations. His conclusion was frustratingly vague. The marks were consistent with scavenging activity, but the species could not be identified. He noted that decomposition and scavenger activity often obscured the original circumstances of death, and that the marks might have been made months or even years after Emma died by any number of animals that had found the remains. But he couldn't explain the spacing, and he couldn't explain why the bones had been scattered in such a specific pattern, almost as if they'd been deliberately arranged in a rough circle around the limestone outcropping. Leonard Pike, still in custody, was informed of the discovery. His lawyer requested an immediate meeting with prosecutors. Pike had been telling the truth, at least partially. He hadn't killed Emma. The location of her body, the lack of trauma, the impossibility of him transporting her that far into the forest, it all pointed away from him as the primary suspect. The charge was reduced. Pike pleaded guilty to tampering with evidence for keeping the drawing, and he was sentenced to time served plus probation. The murder charge was dropped. He was released from Mobile County Jail on a grey November afternoon, walking out into a crowd of reporters and protesters, some holding signs calling him a killer, others holding signs that said, "What really happened to Emma?" Pike didn't answer questions. He got into a car with his lawyer and disappeared from public view. But before he left, he gave one statement to the press, his voice barely audible over the shouting, "I'm sorry I kept that drawing. I'm sorry I didn't come forward, but I didn't hurt that little girl, and I hope they find what did." The investigation shifted once again. If Pike hadn't killed Emma, then who or what had? The FBI brought in a new team, specialists in cold cases and unusual circumstances. They re-interviewed everyone from 1999 who was still alive. They used ground-penetrating radar to search for additional remains or evidence. They brought in cadaver dogs to sweep the entire area within a 10-mile radius of where Emma's bones had been found. They found nothing else, just those small bones, arranged in a circle, marked with grooves that no one could explain. The locals, meanwhile, had their own theories. The stories that had been whispered in 1999 came back louder now, spoken in diners and gas stations, debated on local forums and social media groups. People talked about the old Cherokee legends of the Yunwi Tsunsdi, the little people who lived in the mountains and sometimes took children who wandered too far from home. They talked about the Nalusa Falaya, the tall shadow beings from Creek tradition that moved through the forest at night. They talked about sightings over the years, fleeting glimpses of something large and bipedal moving through the trees with impossible speed. A retired park ranger named David Cook came forward with a story he'd never told officially. In 2002, 3 years after Emma disappeared, he'd been on patrol in a remote section of the Bankhead Forest when he'd found a campsite that had been destroyed. The tent was shredded, the cooler crushed, food scattered everywhere. At first, he'd assumed it was bears, but the damage pattern was wrong. Bears ripped and clawed with a distinctive randomness. This had been methodical, almost purposeful. And near the campsite, he'd found tracks, large, bipedal, leading off into the forest. He'd filed a report noting possible bear activity, but he'd never forgotten those tracks. Other stories emerged. A hunter who'd heard screams in the forest in 2008. Not human, not animal, something in between. A couple who'd been camping in 2015 and had heard heavy footsteps circling their tent at night. Something breathing just outside the fabric, too large to be a person. A teenager who'd been hiking with friends in 2019 and had found a dead deer hanging from a tree branch 12 feet off the ground, its neck broken, its body positioned in a way that suggested something had placed it there, deliberately. Were these stories real? Or were they the product of fear and imagination, the human need to find patterns in chaos, to give shape to the shapeless? The FBI didn't officially investigate the possibility of an unknown animal or entity. It fell outside their jurisdiction, outside the boundaries of what they were equipped to handle. But unofficially, some of the agents looked into it. They contacted cryptozoologists and wildlife experts who specialized in unusual sightings. They reviewed reports of similar cases across the country, children who disappeared in remote areas, whose remains were found in impossible locations, whose deaths defied explanation. There were more cases than anyone wanted to admit. Not many, but enough to form a pattern. Children vanishing in national forests, in the deep wilderness, under circumstances that suggested something beyond human involvement. Some were never found. Others, like Emma, were discovered years later, their bones showing signs of activity that couldn't be classified. The official explanation was always animals, predators, accidents, natural causes. But the unofficial whispers spoke of something else, something that lived in the spaces humans had forgotten, something intelligent and powerful and utterly outside the framework of modern understanding. And in the Bankhead Forest, people started staying out of the deep woods. Hikers stuck to marked trails, hunters worked in groups, parents watched their children more carefully when they played outside. The forest, which had always been a place of beauty and recreation, took on a darker cast. It became a place of warning, a reminder that there are still wild things in the world, things we can't control or comprehend. Patricia Whitfield made the trip back to Cullman County for the first time in 15 years. She wanted to see where Emma had been found, wanted to stand on the ground where her daughter had spent the last 26 years. The authorities allowed it, escorting her through the forest to the limestone outcropping where Jennifer Costner had made the discovery. Patricia stood there for a long time, looking at the place where the bones had been, at the circle of disturbed earth that had since been reclaimed by moss and ferns. She knelt down, touched the ground, and cried for the first time since learning Emma was dead. Not for herself, not for the years of not knowing, but for Emma. For a 7-year-old girl who should have grown up, who should have had a life, who should have been safe. When Patricia stood up, she looked into the forest, into the deep shadows between the trees, and she felt something. Not fear, exactly, not peace either, just a presence, vast and ancient and watching. She couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything, but she felt it the way you feel a storm coming before the first drops of rain. She turned to the deputy who'd escorted her and said, "Something took my daughter. I don't know what it was. Maybe I never will. But it wasn't a person. I know that now." The deputy didn't argue. He'd grown up in these woods, had heard the stories his whole life. He just nodded and said, "Yes, ma'am, I believe you're right." Emma's remains were released to Patricia 3 weeks later, after all the forensic work was complete. Patricia had her daughter cremated, and on a cold December morning, she scattered Emma's ashes at Doris's old property near the chicken coop where Emma had last been seen alive. A small group attended, a few relatives, some of the volunteers who'd searched in 1999, Marcus Halloran, now a captain with the sheriff's department. Patricia said a few words, talking about Emma's love of drawing, her kindness to animals, the light she'd brought into the world during her brief time here, and then she scattered the ashes, letting the wind carry them into the trees, into the forest that had taken and held her daughter for so long. As the mourners left, Marcus Halloran stayed behind. He walked to the edge of the tree line, looked into the shadows, and felt that same presence Patricia had described. Something watching, something aware. He'd felt it in 1999, though he'd never admitted it to anyone. He felt it now. He stood there for a moment, then spoke quietly, not sure if he was talking to the forest or to whatever lived in it. "She's home now. Let her rest." The forest didn't answer. The trees swayed slightly in the wind. A crow called in the distance. And Marcus turned and walked back to his car, leaving the Whitfield property for the last time. The case was officially closed in January 2026. The FBI filed its final report, concluding that Emma Grace Whitfield had died of undetermined causes in October 1999, and that her remains had been scattered by natural scavenger activity over the course of 26 years. Leonard Pike was noted as a person of interest who had tampered with evidence but was not responsible for Emma's death. No other suspects were identified. The report didn't mention the claw marks. It didn't mention the tracks. It didn't mention the trail camera photo or the stories from locals. Those details were included in supplementary files, noted but not emphasized, acknowledged but not explained. Because how do you explain something that doesn't fit the categories of human understanding? How do you write in an official report that something unknown might live in the forests of Alabama, something that has existed longer than the towns and roads and farms, something that operates by rules we don't recognize? You don't. You file the case as closed, you offer condolences to the family, and you move on. Because the alternative is to admit that there are still mysteries in the world, still dangers that can't be mitigated by laws or forensic science or armed officers. And that's not a truth most people are ready to accept. But in Cullman County, in the small towns that border the Bankhead National Forest, people knew. They'd always known. The forest was beautiful, yes. It was home. But it was also something else, something older, something that demanded respect and caution. And on quiet nights, when the wind moved through the pines and the shadows grew long, people locked their doors and kept their children close. Because they remembered Emma Grace Whitfield. They remembered what the forest had taken. And they knew, deep in the places where logic gives way to instinct, that it could happen again. Was it an animal? A person? Something else entirely? The answer depends on what you're willing to believe, on whether you trust the evidence of the rational world or the whispers of something deeper, something that has lived in the dark places since before we gave them names. 3 months after Emma's ashes were scattered, something happened that brought the case back into the public eye one final time. A documentary filmmaker named Rebecca Moss had been following the Emma Whitfield case since Leonard Pike's arrest. Rebecca specialized in unsolved mysteries and cold cases, and she'd been granted unusual access to the investigation. Interviews with detectives, crime scene photos, forensic reports. She'd spent weeks in Cullman County, talking to locals, walking the forests, trying to understand what had happened to Emma Grace Whitfield. Rebecca had approached the story as a journalist, skeptical of supernatural explanations, focused on finding the human truth beneath the folklore. But the more she investigated, the more the rational explanations fell apart. She interviewed the forensic anthropologist who'd examined Emma's bones. She spoke with wildlife experts who couldn't identify the tooth marks. She reviewed the trail camera footage frame by frame, consulted with image analysis specialists who couldn't explain what the camera had captured. And then Rebecca did something that changed her perspective entirely. She spent 3 nights camping alone in the Bankhead Forest, in the area where Emma's remains had been found. She documented everything with body cameras, audio recorders, and motion-activated equipment. The first night was uneventful, cold, quiet, nothing but the normal sounds of the forest at night. The second night, around 2 in the morning, her equipment picked up something unusual. A series of knocking sounds, wood striking wood with a rhythmic pattern, coming from multiple directions in the forest. The sounds weren't random. They seemed to be communicating, responding to each other. Rebecca sat in her tent, listening, her heart pounding. She'd read about this phenomenon. Researchers investigating unknown primates had documented similar wood-knocking sounds in forests across North America. But hearing it in person, alone in the dark, was different. The sounds were purposeful, intelligent. Then, on the 3rd night, she saw something. She was outside her tent, sitting by a small campfire, when she heard movement in the trees about 50 yards away. She grabbed her flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. The beam caught something moving between the trunks, something tall, covered in dark hair or fur, moving with a smooth, powerful stride that was distinctly bipedal. It was there for perhaps 3 seconds before disappearing into the deeper shadows. Rebecca's camera was recording. When she reviewed the footage later, the figure was barely visible, a dark shape against darker trees, obscured by distance and low light. But it was there. Something large and upright, something that didn't match any known animal in the region. She packed up her campsite at first light and drove straight to Patricia Whitfield's apartment in Birmingham. Patricia watched the footage 3 times, sitting on her couch with her hands clasped in her lap. When it was over, she looked at Rebecca and said, "That's what took my daughter, isn't it?" Rebecca hesitated, then nodded. "I think so. I can't prove it. I don't even know what it is. But yes, I think that's what happened." Patricia was quiet for a long time. Then she asked, "Why? Why would it take a child?" Rebecca had no answer. Neither did anyone else. The motivations of an unknown species, if that's what it was, were completely opaque. Did it see Emma as prey, as something to protect or relocate, as a curiosity? There was no way to know. But Rebecca's footage reignited the debate. When her documentary premiered on a major streaming platform in March 2026, it became one of the most watched releases of the year. Millions of people saw the evidence, heard the testimonies, and drew their own conclusions. Some dismissed it as elaborate fiction, expertly crafted but ultimately entertainment. Others believed every word, saw in Emma's story confirmation of what they'd always suspected, that there are still mysteries in the wild places, still creatures unknown to science. The documentary sparked renewed interest in similar cases. Families who'd lost children in wilderness areas came forward with their own stories, their own impossible details that had never made sense. A database was created, tracking disappearances in national forests and remote areas that showed unusual characteristics. The numbers were small but consistent, a handful of cases each year spread across the country, all sharing certain elements. Difficult terrain, impossible distances. Remains found in locations that defied logic, evidence that suggested something other than human involvement. The scientific community remained divided. Some researchers argued for increased study of the possibility of unknown primate species in North America. Others dismissed the entire premise as folklore and misidentification, insisting that every case could be explained through conventional means if enough investigation was applied. But in the forests themselves, among the people who lived and worked there, the truth was simpler. They knew. They'd always known. Their grandparents had known. Their great-grandparents before them. The woods were home to more than deer and bears and coyotes. There was something else, something that moved through the deep places, something that appeared in stories across cultures and continents, described differently, but recognized as the same essential thing. A creature of the wilderness. Powerful, intelligent, elusive, and occasionally dangerous. Marcus Halloran, now retired from the Sheriff's Department, watched Rebecca Moss's documentary from his living room in Cullman County. When it was over, he sat in silence, thinking about that October day in 1999, when he'd first arrived at Doris Whitfield's property. He thought about the searches, the hope that had gradually faded into grim acceptance. He thought about standing at the edge of the forest 26 years later, asking for Emma's spirit to find peace. And he thought about something he'd never told anyone, something that had happened during the original search. On the fourth night, when hope was already thinning but before they'd found the shoe, Marcus had been part of a small group searching a section of forest about 3 miles from the Whitfield property. It was past midnight and most of the volunteers had gone home, but a core team of deputies and experienced woodsmen was still working, using high-powered flashlights to check ravines and dense undergrowth. Marcus had separated slightly from his group, maybe 20 yards, checking a deer trail that led down a steep slope. He was sweeping his flashlight back and forth when he heard something behind him, a rustling in the leaves, heavy and deliberate. He spun around, bringing his light up, and saw eyes. 2 eyes reflecting the flashlight beam, positioned about 7 feet off the ground, far too high to be a deer or any animal he recognized. The eyes stared at him for a long moment, unblinking. Marcus reached for his radio, but before he could speak, the eyes disappeared, not moving away, not turning, just gone, as if whatever had been there had simply stepped out of existence. Marcus had convinced himself it was a trick of the light, a reflection off something in the trees. He never mentioned it in his reports, never told his fellow deputies, but he'd never forgotten it. And when Patricia Whitfield told him she felt something watching in the forest, he'd known exactly what she meant. Now, sitting in his living room with the documentary credits rolling, Marcus made a decision. He picked up his phone and called Patricia. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice cautious. They'd stayed in touch over the years, occasional calls and messages, a connection forged by shared tragedy. Marcus had attended the memorial service where Emma's ashes were scattered. "I saw something the night we were searching for Emma," Marcus said without preamble, "something I never reported. I think you deserve to know." He told her about the eyes, about the presence he'd felt, about the certainty that something had been watching him in those woods. Patricia listened in silence. When he finished, she took a long breath. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. I think part of me needed to hear that, needed to know I wasn't imagining it." They talked for a while longer, sharing memories of Emma, of the investigation, of the decades that had passed. Before they hung up, Patricia said something that stayed with Marcus for the rest of his life. "I used to be so angry," she said. "Angry at God, at the world, at whatever took my daughter. But I'm not anymore. I think Emma wandered into a part of the world we're not meant to understand. And maybe that's okay. Maybe there should be mysteries we can't solve, places we can't tame. It doesn't make losing her hurt less, but it helps me accept it." Marcus understood. The world had become so mapped, so documented, so thoroughly explored, that the idea of true wilderness, of places and things beyond human knowledge, seemed impossible. But it wasn't. There were still wild spaces, still unknowns, and maybe in a strange way, that was something worth preserving. In the months following the documentary's release, the Bankhead National Forest saw an influx of visitors. Some were researchers, armed with cameras and recording equipment, hoping to document evidence of the creature Rebecca Moss had filmed. Others were thrill-seekers and amateur investigators, drawn by the mystery and the possibility of encountering something unknown. The U.S. Forest Service responded by increasing patrols and posting warning signs about the dangers of hiking alone in remote areas. They didn't mention Emma Whitfield or unknown creatures. They simply reminded visitors that the forest was wild, that people should stay on marked trails, that the woods demanded respect. But the rangers knew. They'd heard the stories. Some of them had their own experiences, strange sounds, fleeting glimpses, the feeling of being watched by something that disappeared when you turned to look. They didn't talk about it officially, but among themselves they shared information. Areas where people reported unusual activity, times of year when the sightings increased, patterns that might help keep visitors safe. One ranger, a woman named Caitlin Torres, who'd worked in the Bankhead Forest for 12 years, started keeping a private log of incidents. Nothing official, just notes for herself. Strange tracks found on trails, campers reporting encounters with something they couldn't identify, areas where wildlife suddenly went silent. She didn't know what she was documenting, but she felt compelled to record it, to create a record that might someday be useful. Caitlin had never believed in cryptids or forest monsters. She'd grown up in Arizona, spent years working in national parks across the Southwest, and considered herself a practical, science-minded person. But the Bankhead Forest had changed her perspective. There was something about these woods, something older and less forgiving than the deserts she'd known. She couldn't explain it, but she felt it every time she went on patrol. One evening in late spring, Caitlin was closing up a remote ranger station when she noticed something carved into a tree near the parking area. The carving was fresh, the exposed wood still pale and weeping sap. It wasn't graffiti. No words or symbols, just a series of vertical lines gouged deep into the bark, spaced evenly, running from about 4 feet off the ground to nearly 9 feet up. Caitlin took photos, measured the marks, and filed them in her private log. She'd seen similar markings before, always in remote areas, always too high and too deep to be made casually. She didn't know what created them, but she knew they weren't made by people. That night, sitting in her cabin on the edge of the forest, Caitlin thought about Emma Whitfield. She thought about a 7-year-old girl who'd walked into these woods and never walked out. She thought about Patricia Whitfield, who'd lived 26 years not knowing what happened to her daughter, and she made a decision. She contacted Rebecca Moss and offered to share her log. Rebecca incorporated Caitlin's information into a follow-up documentary released 8 months later. The sequel focused less on Emma's specific case and more on the broader pattern of disappearances and unusual activity in wilderness areas across the United States. It featured interviews with rangers, search and rescue personnel, wildlife biologists, and families who'd lost loved ones under mysterious circumstances. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of people came forward with their own stories. Encounters in the woods, sightings that didn't match known animals, experiences that had left them shaken and confused. Some were clearly misidentifications or hoaxes, but others were harder to dismiss. Credible witnesses. Multiple accounts from different locations describing similar phenomena. Physical evidence that defied easy explanation. A pattern emerged. Whatever these things were, these creatures that moved through the deep forests, they were widespread, not common, but present. Across North America, across continents, existing in the spaces humans had abandoned or never fully occupied. They were intelligent enough to avoid sustained contact, strong enough to leave evidence of their passage. And occasionally, for reasons no one understood, they interacted with humans in ways that ranged from benign to tragic. The scientific establishment remained skeptical, demanding better evidence, controlled studies, clear proof before committing to investigation. But outside academia, the conversation shifted. People began taking the possibility seriously, not as entertainment or folklore, but as a legitimate question about what might still be undiscovered in the wild places of the world. Patricia Whitfield watched this shift with quiet satisfaction. She'd never wanted fame or attention. She'd never sought to become a spokesperson for unexplained disappearances. But if Emma's story could help other families find answers, or at least find a framework for understanding their loss, then perhaps some meaning could be drawn from the tragedy. In April 2027, Patricia returned to Cullman County one last time. She drove to her mother's old property, which had been sold years ago, and was now owned by a family who'd renovated the farmhouse and kept the land maintained. She'd called ahead, explained who she was, and the new owners graciously allowed her to visit. Patricia walked across the yard to the spot where the chicken coop used to be. It was gone now, replaced by a vegetable garden, but she knew the exact location. She stood there looking at the tree line and felt the same presence she'd felt before, watching, waiting, not threatening exactly, just there, existing in parallel to the human world, occasionally intersecting in ways that defied understanding. She spoke aloud, her voice steady. "I don't know what you are. I don't know why you took my daughter, but I forgive you. I don't understand you, and I never will, but I forgive you. Emma is at peace now. I hope you are too." The forest didn't respond. The wind moved through the pines. A bird called from somewhere in the distance. Patricia stood there for a few more minutes, then turned and walked back to her car. She never returned to Cullman County after that. She didn't need to. Emma was everywhere now. In the stories people told, in the documentaries that kept her memory alive, in the renewed attention to wilderness safety and missing persons cases. Emma had become larger than her brief life, a symbol of the mystery and danger that still existed in the wild places, a reminder that for all our technology and knowledge, there were still things we couldn't explain. Patricia moved to the coast, to a small town in Florida where she could see the ocean every day. She found work at a hospital, made new friends, built a quiet life. She kept Emma's school photos on her mantle, along with the few drawings that hadn't been lost. She remembered her daughter every day, but the memory no longer hurt the way it once had. It had transformed into something else, not peace exactly, but acceptance, the understanding that some questions don't have answers, and that's part of being human. On the anniversary of Emma's disappearance each year, Patricia lit a candle, and sat quietly for an hour, thinking about the little girl with hazel eyes and sandy blonde hair who'd loved drawing birds. She thought about the laughter, the small hands that had held hers, the future that had been stolen. And she thought about the forest, about whatever lived in those shadows, and she hoped that somehow, in ways she couldn't comprehend, Emma's spirit had found its way home. In Cullman County, the story of Emma Grace Whitfield became part of the local fabric. Children grew up hearing about the little girl who'd vanished. Parents used her story to teach caution about the woods, and elderly residents nodded knowingly when younger folks expressed skepticism about what might live in the deep forest. The story was told in schools, in churches, in the barbershop and the diner. It evolved slightly with each telling, picking up new details, losing others, but the core remained the same. A child went into the woods and didn't come back. And something in those woods, something powerful and unknown, had been there when it happened. The rational explanation existed, of course. It was possible that Emma had simply wandered off, become lost, succumbed to the elements or an animal attack, and her remains had been scattered by natural processes over 26 years. It was possible that the strange evidence, the claw marks, the tracks, the sightings, were all coincidences and misidentifications. It was possible that Leonard Pike had been more involved than the evidence suggested, that there were gaps in the investigation, human errors that had allowed the real culprit to escape detection. All of that was possible. All of it was rational. But the people who lived in those woods, who walked those trails and heard those sounds in the night, they knew something different. They knew in the way animals know when a storm is coming, in the way you know when you're being watched, even when you can't see the watcher. They knew that the rational explanations, while plausible, weren't complete, that there was something else, something that had existed in those forests long before towns and roads, something that would exist long after, and maybe that was okay. Maybe the world needed mysteries. Maybe we needed places we couldn't fully understand, creatures we couldn't fully document, questions we couldn't fully answer. Maybe that's what kept us humble, kept us aware that despite all our progress and knowledge, we were still just one species among many, sharing a planet we didn't completely control. Rebecca Moss continued her work, investigating other cases, documenting patterns, building a database of unexplained disappearances in wilderness areas. She never claimed to have definitive proof of an unknown species. She simply presented evidence and let viewers draw their own conclusions. Her documentaries became increasingly influential, sparking academic interest in wilderness research, improving search and rescue protocols, and encouraging more rigorous investigation of missing persons cases. Marcus Halloran passed away in 2029, 2 years after Patricia's final visit to Cullman County. He died peacefully in his sleep, and his funeral was attended by dozens of people whose lives he touched during his career in law enforcement. Among his personal effects, his family found a journal he'd kept throughout his years as a deputy and later as a sergeant. Most of it was routine notes about cases and investigations, but there was one entry, dated October 21st, 1999, that caught their attention. It read, "Tonight, I saw something in the woods that I can't explain. Eyes that shouldn't have been there watching me from a height that's impossible for any animal I know. I've decided not to report it because I don't want to sound crazy, but I know what I saw. And I know we're not alone in these forests. Whatever took Emma Whitfield, I think it was watching me tonight. I think it was deciding whether I was a threat. I don't know what would have happened if it had decided differently. I'm just grateful I'm still here to write this." His family shared the entry with Patricia, who read it with tears in her eyes. It confirmed what she'd always believed, what Marcus had finally told her years later. The mystery was real, the presence was real, and Emma had encountered it in a way that had cost her everything. The Bankhead National Forest remains open to visitors, beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. People still hike its trails, camp in its clearings, hunt in its remote sections. Most of them never see anything unusual. They experience the forest as it presents itself, a place of natural beauty, of birdsong and rustling leaves, of sunlight filtering through canopy and the peaceful solitude of wilderness. But occasionally, someone sees something else. A shape moving between trees with a gait that's not quite human. Eyes reflecting light from an impossible height. Sounds that don't match any known animal. And those people come back changed, carrying with them a story they're not sure anyone will believe, a memory that doesn't fit into the categories of normal experience. Some of them report it, most don't. Because what do you say? How do you explain that you saw something that shouldn't exist, felt something that shouldn't be possible? How do you convince others when you're not entirely sure yourself? So the stories accumulate, shared quietly among those who understand, dismissed by those who don't, existing in the space between proof and faith. And the forest keeps its secrets, generation after generation, waiting for the next time someone wanders a little too far, stays a little too long, encounters something that will change their understanding of what's possible. Emma Grace Whitfield has been gone for over 26 years now. Her body has been laid to rest, her story has been told, and her mother has found a measure of peace. But her legacy continues, in the improved safety protocols for wilderness areas, in the families who share their stories of unexplained loss, in the renewed acknowledgement that nature is not fully tamed, that wilderness means wild, and that we share this world with more than we can see or understand. Every October, on the anniversary of her disappearance, people in Cullman County pause to remember a little girl with sandy blonde hair and a gentle smile who loved drawing birds. Some light candles, some visit the forest's edge and leave flowers. Some simply say her name aloud, making sure she's not forgotten. And in the Bankhead National Forest, in the deep places where the canopy grows thick and the shadows pool like water, something moves through the darkness. Patient, powerful, unknown. It doesn't emerge often, it doesn't seek contact with the human world. But it's there, existing in the spaces we've left behind, in the wild corners that progress hasn't reached. Is it dangerous? Sometimes. Is it malevolent? That's harder to say. Perhaps it's simply wild in the truest sense, operating by rules we don't understand, motivated by drives we can't comprehend, existing outside the framework of human morality and judgment. Patricia Whitfield never learned what took her daughter. She never got a complete answer to the question that haunted her for 26 years. But in the end, she found something more valuable than answers. She found acceptance. The ability to live with uncertainty, to carry loss without letting it destroy her, to find meaning even in tragedy. When Patricia passes away someday, she's requested that her ashes be scattered in the same place as Emma's, near the tree line of her mother's old property. She wants to return to that liminal space, that boundary between the known world and the wild. She wants to be close to her daughter, wherever Emma's spirit might be. And when that day comes, the people of Cullman County will gather one more time. They'll tell the story again, passing it on to a new generation. They'll speak of Emma Grace Whitfield, a 7-year-old girl who vanished into the Alabama woods on a perfect October afternoon, and whose disappearance revealed that for all our certainty about the world, mystery still exists. The story will continue to evolve, shaped by new evidence and new perspectives, by the ongoing debate between rational explanation and unknown possibility. But at its core, it will always be about a little girl who walked into the forest and didn't come back. And the question that haunts us all, what's really out there in the wild places, watching from the shadows, existing just beyond the reach of our understanding? The answer depends on what you're willing to believe. Whether you trust the evidence of science or the whispers of instinct, whether you think the world has been fully explored or whether there are still secrets waiting in the deep woods, still mysteries that resist explanation. Emma Grace. Whitfield's story doesn't provide that answer. It simply asks the question over and over, inviting each of us to consider what we think is possible, what we're willing to accept as real. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the question is more important than the answer. Maybe living with mystery, with uncertainty, with the knowledge that some things can't be fully known or understood, is part of what makes us human. In the Bankhead National Forest, the trees grow tall and the shadows run deep. The wind moves through the pines like breathing. And somewhere in those woods, in the places where the trail ends and the wild begins, something moves through the darkness, watching, waiting, enduring. Just as it always has, just as it always will. Was what happened to Emma the result of human cruelty, or something we still can't explain?